Hello and welcome back to Diablo 4. This might be the case for you with the Gauntlet finally being released to the game. Will it hit what the game needs right now? You know, an actual endgame system, a reason to actually be farming Malthus and Duriel? We're gonna have to see. But if you're a Necromancer player like me, you're gonna want to be prepared for the Gauntlet with a proper build in mind. Things are changing for us across the board. There's a variety of buffs we're gonna talk about coming with this Gauntlet patch. There is some hope for us, and I'm expecting even more so in Season 4. A major detail for Necromancers is gonna be the return of Metamorphosis, the vampiric power from Season 2. It gives us a short dash which generates Unstoppable, which Necromancers don't have a good source of, unlike every other class. Our best and real only option is Blood Mist, which for most builds is a self CC and DPS loss. It really deserves an update compared to what the other classes are doing, but for now we have this band-aid fix in the form of meta called of Metamorphosis aspect, a new aspect that's apparently a mobility aspect. That means it can go straight onto our boots, giving us Unstoppable for 2.5 seconds, also applying Vampiric Curse again, but for some reason it's going to increase our evade cooldown anywhere from an extra 5 to 10 seconds based on your roll. Necromancers need more help, we don't need negatives. On the bright side, this means we can use Tybalt's Will again. Finally, just like every other class, we're going to get 40% times increased damage while unstoppable and for 4 seconds after. Also, that means 50 essence when we do this. It's absolutely wonderful. It's finally back for us. With that in mind, you're definitely going to want the new aspect, which means if it's on boots, you're going to have to be farming boots aggressively. However you do that, for whatever means you can do, but I would recommend the Purveyor of Curiosities here using obols. If you roll 40 obols, you can get a pair of boots, potentially with an aspect, potentially with that new aspect on. So it's going to be a very good idea to have your obols capped before the Gauntlet drops, so you can roll a ton of boots and hopefully get the new aspect. On that note, you're definitely going to be aware of the new feature at any jeweler. There's a new tab called Craft Construct Items. Under Exchange, you have the Murmuring Caches. This, as you can see, for 500 Shattered Stones, will give you 50 Murmuring Obols when you actually open the cache. So that could help you get to the cap in prep, or help you roll a bunch more boots than you would otherwise be able to, since we should have tons of Shattered Stones. You're definitely going to want that new aspect pretty much for every damn Necromancer build at this point, so it's very much worth preparing and doing that on the day. Now, the build for the Gauntlet with that in mind is going to be Bone Spear. Of course it's Bone Spear. With everything else being buffed in helpful ways, like say Blood Surge or Sever, and even the minions across the board getting more damage and life, these are all great changes, but in theory, they still will not remotely compete with Bone Spear, especially with speed and target boss killing in mind, which is what you need in the Gauntlet. Bone Spear simply kills things faster, from range, from safety, with higher consistent DPS, which means when you bump into those bosses for the objectives, you're gonna be able to kill them much faster. In short, Blood Surge looks like a fun, good option, especially for mobility, but Bone Spear looks better. Infinite Mist has too much single target DPS problems to really consider, so things like Sever and also Corpse Explosion builds, they're gonna be what we're looking into. Speaking of which, there is a neat update around that for us. Pretty random feeling buff to Corpse Explosion damage after they decided to nerf it a bit in Season 3 originally. The base CE is increased by 21.5% damage, and then the Plague version is up from 8% to 10% for its damage bonus. For us, it's just an extra smidge of damage that isn't going to matter a ton, but is welcome, but it does make those Corpse Explosion focused builds more relevant, and should make the unique Black River even higher in value. Testing's going to need to happen around that, what's going to be worth sacrificing to run those, but really, I view this more as them reverting a bit on the nerfs we saw in Season 3, which made no sense to me, and that's why Necromancer balancing and lack of real updates is very frustrating for me. You look at Barbarians, they're absolutely nuts, and have been for some time. Are they getting any relevant nerfs with this patch? Nope, but we are getting some benefits with negatives at the same time. In that, I'm talking about the new Death's Approach, which was previously named Death's Reach. As you can see, that gives us 12% times increased damage to distant enemies. This is a major DPS increase for a Bone Spear build. This is being completely removed. It's now changed to Death's Approach, and it's going to give us 12% increased movement speed flat. Why they've done this in this way, I genuinely don't know. Necromancer is certainly not the top class in Season 3, it's far from it, so why we're having to pay for the movement speed we've been crying for since pre-season is anyone's guess. Still, an extra 12% movement speed, even if minor, is what I will take compared to nothing. And on the bright side, Death's Embrace is getting a slight buff to close enemy DPS. It's going to be an extra 3% at its top rank. So overall a DPS loss, but at least they gave us something back a little bit. But yeah, our build is going to be Bone Spear with some important changes, a bigger focus on spreading Bone Storms from mob clearing packs effectively, caring much more about move speed to get you through the gauntlets fast, and with this build plan, you should be able to kill instantly everything, since it's only going to be around level 120. Also, you'll be crushing bosses with your insane DPS when you encounter them and complete those objectives quickly. We will lose some survivability in exchange for the much stronger DPS and burst and movement, but it should be well worth it in this setting. So let's go through the build and explain everything in detail. In regards to explaining everything, I'm going to be pretty quick since it's going to be what we've seen before with some minor changes. We are running Bone Splinters with Enhanced. It's just to get through here. It's our basic that's just on the board when we need to actually get Essence Gen, but you should rarely ever use that. Max out Bone Spear, it's your main damage source, Enhanced to Supernatural. We need it to be generating Vulnerable since they changed our splintering aspect to no longer generate Vulnerable in a consistent, reliable way. It was bugged for a good while and we definitely used that as a crutch, but they removed that effect, so now we need Supernatural Bone Spear for the vulnerable. We're maxing out on living energy and imperfectly balanced as usual for the bigger DPS on Bone Spear and better max essence. 3 out of 3 hued flesh for the spawning of corpses. We're taking Blood Mist and relying on that as an unstoppable source here and there, but definitely enhancing it to Ghastly so that we generate corpses. This is going to tie into Gravekeeper from our Paragon and gives you a reliable corpse tendril to use at the start of every boss fight. It allows you to set up burst at certain objectives or points, and that's going to be really important. One single point into Corpse Explosion just to get the effect. We're going to be using a ring that's auto triggering these, and we're going to get lots of benefits from those corpse explosions, not the damage of the CE itself, but by the proccing of it, so we don't need to actually spend anything on it. On that note, Grim Harvest 3 out of 3 is going to help us generate essence whenever those pop, and Fuel by Death is going to give us that 9% times increased damage for 6 seconds when we pop a corpse. We're still going 3 out of 3 Death's Embrace for the close enemy DR and also increase R damage to them. Death's Reach, which is changing to movement speed, we're taking 3 out of 3 on that. 1 point in Corpse Tendrils and Enhanced to Plagued for the vulnerable gen on that. 3 out of 3 Serration, Compound Fracture, and Evulsion. You see I've got 3 extra ranks here from my amulet. This is the biggest DPS increase passive skill we have for Bone Spear. On the final tree, we have Bone Storm in its full, maxing out Standalone and Memento Mori as usual, taking our key passive of Ossified Essence, and then dumping our remaining points into Inspiring Leader for a little bit of extra attack speed, which helps us send out Bone Spears faster. For the Book of the Dead, it's the same as it was before. Skirmishers sacrifice for the crit strike chance, Skeleton Mages on Cold for the vulnerable enemy increased damage, and then finally Golem on Iron, of course, for the critical strike damage increase as usual. This brings us to the Paragon, which is what I was running before because it's going to work exactly the same. We have our starter board here, which is where I'm running Gravekeeper still, as it is just the best board to efficiently get this to its maximum. Gravekeeper increases your damage for nearby corpses, and we're going to be generating a ton of them, as well as actually giving a bonus to nearby rare nodes. We get a lot of value out of that on, say, this starter board. It's an extra 19.5% damage, which is nuts, as well as the armor we get from, say, Preservation. Anyway, this is our starter board, where I spend my nodes. Then we come to our second board, which is as usual, Bone Graph. I rotate it like so to efficiently get to our third board, and the glyph we're using here is still Corporeal. Again, Corporeal is a type of glyph that gives extra bonuses to different nodes, so all the nodes around it are getting an extra 114% bonus. So, extra resistance to all elements here, extra bone skill damage, which is vital, and that's kind of why we place it there with that in mind. Also, Corporeal itself is a 10% times increased physical damage, which if you didn't realize, Bone Spear is physical damage, so it's pretty damn major, and we only need to get it to exactly 40 intelligence and no more beyond that, just to get it active. Also, obviously, we're coming up to pick up Calcified, the nodes around that, and then Reinvigorate with all the nodes around that. And then we come up to the top right to Bone Graft to activate that, picking up the extra bit of crit strike damage with Bone Skills on the way. Then we'll work our way left to our third board, which as before is Scent of Death. It's either a damage increase when no corpses are nearby, or a DR when there are. And then having it as our third board helps you get things like Corrective and Ruin active easily. So we enter the board and come down and around, picking up Scent of Death, Ruin, and the nodes around that, and we come to the glyph, which is Exploit as before. This increases your vulnerable damage, and dealing damage to vulnerable enemies will increase your overall damage by up to 10% times, so it's very impactful. We push this as far as I can with the points I have on the third board to 34 extra. We work our way up through Preservation on the way out, coming to the right to pick up Corrective. This gives us extra crit strike damage, which is very nice. There's 3 nodes here that do more of that. And we come to our 4th board, which again, just as before, is Flesh Eater. Consuming 5 corpses is a 40% times increased damage for 6 seconds. So popping corpses regularly is very important. It's a big DPS increase. I'm going to be doing that automatically through our ring. So we come from the bottom of the board and work our way through Stifle, picking up the nodes around that for extra quick strike damage, grabbing the legendary node and working our way to the glyph, which is still sacrificial. This is a straight 10% times increased damage flat out for just being active when we have no minions. But again, it's one that gives a bonus to all magic nodes within its range. So an extra 114%. That means more extra resistance to all elements, extra damage to elites, bonus dexterity, and things like that. Is very efficient, especially on the 4th board here. Also, while I'm here, I come up to the right to color just to get the extra attack speed that these nodes provide, so more bone spears faster. Then we'll come to the left to our 5th and final board, which is just a filler board for an extra glyph socket. There are a few boards you could pick, but Bloodbath just works really well since you only need to spend 5 node points here to actually reach the glyph, which is well worth it. The final glyph is still Essence, increasing our critical strike damage, and also when it's active, it means even more damage to enemies that are not healthy. We want to push this as high as we can, so you see how I get it to 49 dexterity, and this is how I spend my points around that to achieve that. But yeah, pretty much the same as before. It's very effective from your Paragon. Next up, our Construct. We are running, as usual, Tempest and Flash of Adrenaline. Flash of Adrenaline is going to give us a nice DPS increase, up to 20% times for 12 seconds when you have duration support. We're running that and tactical support so that the cooldown's reduced, so it's pretty much always active. What you want as your 3rd support is not Safeguard support. Obviously, what you're going to want is Genesis to majorly increase the effect of that damage. It'd be 35% times instead of 20%, which is massive, but obviously, even though I've killed a lot of Malthus, still not got it. Then for Tempest, we're going to be spreading a dot. It's also going to be giving us loads of resources as it does that, which is huge. If you run Breaking with that, it's going to spread Vulnerable, which is very convenient. And then your 3rd support would ideally be Evernight, but running Arcing instead, especially for the Gauntlet, is perfectly fine as an alternative, spreading the actual Tempest dot to loads of enemies. Next, we have our gear section, and this includes no Uber Uniques, which is a huge relief, I'm sure, if you haven't got any. Starting from the top, we have our helmet. Deathless Visage is what I've got running here for max DPS. You could slot this out for a defensive aspect if you need it, but you shouldn't. This should majorly increase your damage. It also does give you a little bit of DR, which is nice. On the chest, it's very important that we're running Shielding Storm. That is because we're running the unique Lidless Wall, we'll explain shortly, but it means we're spreading Bone Storms a lot, getting very potent shielding from that. So this is our main damage reduction option, especially in the Gauntlet. On the gloves, I've got Serration. It's going to majorly increase your damage if you have more essence when throwing your bone spears, tying into your key passive. You could actually consider running this on your amulet instead of, say, Grasping Veins like I've got, because it'll be more consistent damage but less burst. But I actually value burst higher in the Gauntlet where, you know, the mobs are majorly strong. Now, of course, we're running Tybalt's Will because we actually have a new source of Unstoppable with the season update. That is the new aspect that's going to go into your boots of Metamorphosis. So you're going to run Tybalt's Will as soon as you have those on your boots. And that's going to mean an extra 40% times increased damage while unstoppable for 4 seconds after. And then regularly, this is going to be an extra 50 essence, which is awesome. On the boots right now, I've got Wind Striker because the update's not in game yet, but I will be running of Metamorphosis on this slot, enabling the use of Tybalt's Will. You'll notice that I'm using a one-hand instead of a two-hand now, and I still have Splintering on my main weapon. That is to allow for the offhand Lidless Wall, which is going to be spreading Bone Storm to tons of enemies in packs, which is very effective in the Gauntlet concept. Each of your active sacrifice bonuses increases the chance of the Bone Storms like spawning, so you're spreading tons of them, dealing damage with them, and generating a ton of shield with Shielding Storm. It's going to allow us to kind of bull through the packs without thinking, and obviously we're going to want that in the Gauntlet. Also as a shield, it's some nice DR. On the jewelry, we have our amulet. As I showed, I'm running Grasping Veins on the amulet for the higher burst potential, but I prefer the idea of burst, especially because we're running Sacrilegious Soul as one of our rings. This is going to auto-trigger Corpse Tendrils on a top roll every 8 seconds, constantly triggering that buff. 30% increased crit strike chance in this case, 60% times increased critical strike damage. It is major, especially if you've got a better roll than I have. You could have nutty DPS permanently. Whenever that buff runs out from the auto-triggered ring here, you just manually use Corpse Tendrils and maintain the Grasping Veins as best you can. Also, it's going to auto-trigger your Corpse Explosion tons, which is going to lead to all the different damage procs that will provide. Finally, for the last slot, we have our second ring, which is Exposed Flesh. You could run a top roll Torment instead if you like, if you don't have Exposed Flesh, because it's pretty rare, but this is going to basically solve all your essence problems. If I had the Starless Skies ring, obviously I'd be running that in this slot, because that's absolutely busted. But yeah, those are the aspects. Now let's talk about affixes. As usual, you're going to want levels of Bone Spear on your gloves, and on your amulet, you're going to want Evulsion. As I said in the skill tree section, Evulsion majorly increases your damage to vulnerable enemies. Everything you hit are going to be vulnerable, so it's your best DPS option. Outside of that, I want to highlight that movement speeds can be even more valuable, and you're going to be able to get that on the amulet, so look to do that if you can. Outside of that, it's standard fare. Critical strike chance as much as you can get, and critical strike damage are major DPS increases. Maximum essence and essence gen where possible is also going to make things a lot smoother for you. And you're going to look for movement speed where you can get it, such as on your boots, raw movement speed, and movement speed after killing elite. These can be huge. Under that, things like vulnerable damage, core damage, those can be very nice. But defensively, it's the standard fare, total armor, max life, raw damage reduction, and then the other types like damage reduction when injured, distant or far enemies. That's pretty much just going to be your chest slot, unless you're running a defensive helm, like say Disobedience, for more defensive slots there. For gems, as you can see, we're still running extra health on the armor, and then shield as that's an armor slot. Critical strike damage to vulnerable enemies on the weapon, and then it's whatever you need on your jewelry. You need to check your stats and look at your resistances, and try to have 70% in everything. Get as close as you can, however that's relevant to you. For me, I'm able to get pretty much there with resistance to all elements on all my jewelry. But there you have it. That is my build plan for the Gauntlet and all the reasoning behind it. Overall, Necromancer has finally seen some buffs of importance, which is great. An actual unstoppable aspect to use, some base movement speed increases. Imagine that. It's just hilarious that for some reason they're making it come at different costs, like losing distant damage DPS, making your evade get a longer cooldown. Truly, whoever balances Necromancer needs to look at how they're treating barbs, sorcerers, and otherwise, and realize these extra restrictions have no place for this class. We need help, not restrictions. Hopefully in Season 4 we get more pushes like that for Necro, and I do think we need it. For now though, I'll see you in the Gauntlet. Good luck with it. I've been Hollow, you've been you. Thanks for watching.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.